NATO has owned this promise for 18 years. In 2008, at a summit in Bucharest, NATO leaders told Ukraine it would become a member one day. No timeline, no specific plan, just a promise. Fast forward to 2026, and Ukraine still isn't a member. So the obvious question is, why? Ukraine has fought one of the most brutal wars in modern European history. It has received tens of billions of euros in military support from NATO countries. Its military is now considered one of the most experienced and battle-tested forces in Europe. And yet, full membership still hasn't happened. Here's the thing that makes NATO different from most international organizations. Every single decision requires total consensus. All 32 member countries have to agree. Every single one. That means any one country, for any reason, can effectively block Ukraine's membership. It's not about a majority vote. It's about unanimous agreement. So even if 31 countries wanted Ukraine in tomorrow, one holdout is enough to keep the door closed. This is a genuinely complicated and contested topic, and honestly, there isn't a simple villain here. Different NATO members have different fears, different histories with Russia, and different assessments of the risk involved. In this video, we're going to break the whole picture down into 4 parts. First, we'll look at the history, the actual promise NATO made and how the war changed everything. Then we'll get into the real reason behind the hesitation, a core NATO rule most people don't fully understand. After that, we'll look at the politics, the part that goes beyond just military logic. And finally, we'll look at where things stand right now, heading into what could be a turning point. This isn't a simple story of NATO saying no. It's a story about risk, timing, and 32 countries trying to agree on one of the most consequential decisions in modern European security. Let's start from the beginning. It started in 2008 at NATO's Bucharest summit. Member states issued a declaration saying Ukraine, quote, will become a member of NATO. But there was no roadmap, no timeline, and no formal membership action plan attached to that promise. It was a statement of intent, not a concrete process. In 2014, everything shifted. Russia annexed Crimea, and pro-Russian separatists took control of parts of eastern Ukraine. Ukraine's push toward NATO got significantly louder after that, but so did Russia's warnings about what NATO expansion into Ukraine would mean. Then came February 2022. Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Just days later, Ukraine formally applied for fast-tracked NATO membership, a bold and urgent move in the middle of an active war. In 2023, at the Vilnius summit, NATO allies once again affirmed Ukraine's future in the alliance, but they still stopped short of offering an actual membership action plan. The reasoning many officials gave was straightforward. Admitting a country in the middle of an active war carries enormous risk, since NATO's core defense obligations would apply immediately. By 2026, at the Ankara summit, NATO allies pledged 70 billion euros in military equipment, assistance, and training for Ukraine for that year alone, with commitments to sustain similar levels into 2027. That's an enormous, sustained financial and military commitment. And yet, full membership still hadn't been granted. So here's the pattern that emerges. Massive, consistent military and financial support, paired with continued hesitation on the actual membership question. That gap between support and membership is the real story here, and it's not because of a lack of willingness from Ukraine. Ukrainian public support for joining NATO has consistently polled above 80%, even in the middle of the war. Zelensky himself has repeatedly made the case directly to NATO leaders, arguing that a country with Ukraine's proven defensive capabilities belongs inside the alliance, not outside it. Some NATO officials, including defense ministers from countries like Sweden, have publicly said the sooner Ukraine joins, the better, framing Ukraine now as a security provider rather than just a security recipient. So if there's genuine momentum and genuine support on paper, what's actually holding things back? In the next part, we're going to dig into the core structural reason behind the hesitation, a rule embedded in NATO's entire foundation that changes the calculation completely once a country is in the middle of an active war. It all comes down to one core principle. Article 5. NATO's founding rule states that an armed attack against one member is considered an attack against all members. That's the entire foundation of the alliance, and it's also exactly why Ukraine's situation is so complicated. If Ukraine were to join NATO right now, while still in an active war with Russia, every single NATO member would, in theory, become immediately obligated to respond to that conflict directly. That's not a small technicality. That's the difference between a war involving one country and a war potentially involving 33. This is the central tension driving most of the hesitation. On one side, there's a strong argument that bringing Ukraine into NATO would actually strengthen collective defense, especially along NATO's eastern border, since Ukraine now has one of the most combat-experienced militaries in Europe. Some Baltic and Eastern European members, given their proximity to Russia, have pushed hard for faster action. On the other side, there's an equally serious argument that admitting a country mid-conflict risks direct escalation with a nuclear-armed power, something NATO has deliberately tried to avoid throughout this entire war. It's worth noting that Russia has publicly drawn a distinction here. Russian officials have said they don't necessarily oppose Ukraine joining the European Union, but they've been explicit about opposing Ukraine's NATO membership specifically. That distinction matters, because it shows NATO membership is viewed, at least by Russia, as a fundamentally different and more serious red line than EU membership. So this isn't really a question of whether Ukraine deserves to be in NATO, or whether its military has proven itself. Most NATO officials don't dispute that. The real question is about timing and risk. Specifically, what happens the moment Ukraine officially becomes a member while the war is still ongoing? Does NATO's collective defense obligation trigger a wider war? Or does a strong, protected Ukraine actually make the whole alliance safer? Different member countries land on different sides of that question, based on their own security assessments, their geography, and their own history with Russia. This is genuinely one of the most difficult calculations in modern security policy, and reasonable, well-informed people disagree about the right answer. In the next part, we'll look at the politics behind these decisions, and where things actually stand as of the most recent NATO summit. Beyond the military calculation, there's also a political layer to all of this. Every NATO member country has its own domestic politics, its own economic relationship with the war, and its own historical relationship with Russia to manage. Consensus among 32 different governments, each answering to their own voters and parliaments, is never simple. Meanwhile, inside Ukraine itself, there's very little ambiguity about what people want. Polling has consistently shown over 80% of Ukrainians support NATO membership, even after years of brutal war. President Zelensky has continued making his case directly at NATO summits, arguing that a country with Ukraine's level of proven defensive capability has, in his words, an entirely natural claim to membership. At the 2026 Ankara summit, NATO's approach became a little clearer. Rather than offering a membership timeline, allies doubled down on treating Ukraine as a security provider, pledging 70 billion euros in military support for that year, while affirming similar commitments for the following year. Some officials, including Sweden's defense minister, have publicly said momentum is building, and that the sooner Ukraine joins, the better for both Ukraine and the alliance. But here's the honest reality. NATO's answer since 2008 has essentially been someday. Nobody, including NATO officials themselves, can say precisely when that someday arrives. It depends on how the war evolves, how consensus shifts among all 32 members, and how the risk calculation changes over time. So to bring this together, the promise was made in 2008. The war changed the calculation in 2022. Article 5 creates a genuine structural risk that no member takes lightly. And the politics behind consensus decision-making make rapid movement extremely difficult, even when support seems to be building. This remains one of the most actively debated questions in global security today, and reasonable governments land in very different places on it. Some prioritize Ukraine's security and NATO's long-term strength. Others prioritize avoiding direct escalation with a nuclear power. Neither position is unreasonable, and that's exactly why this remains unresolved. So here's a genuine question for you. Do you think Ukraine should be brought into NATO now, or is the current caution justified? Let me know your take in the comments. Or